welcome to the third episode of Synthesized Sunsets. I'm here with Gordon and Euan McCubbin, who is studying molecular biology at the University of Washington and is also a plant enthusiast. So, Euan, you know a lot about aging at the molecular level. And so I want to ask, what does disintegration mean to you, especially in the context of molecular aging and biological entropy?
So, I guess like the most obvious thing that we think about when you think of like molecular aging is like DNA getting damaged. And like there are so many mechanisms of DNA repair that your body has, but fundamentally there is no system that works and a photon will mess it up eventually. There's so many different slow accumulations. I think that's the best way of like not necessarily disintegration for molecular aging, but accumulations. Um, one of the worst ones are reactive oxygen species. These are kind of things like antioxidants try to go against. They just sort of like damage things. They sort of steal like electrons, cause problems. Proteins will get like damaged by that. They damage DNA themselves. And they're just sort of like an inevitable byproduct of like the metabolism and like the mitochondria. And so it sort of like builds up, and that cascades into this idea of proteostasis. So your body obviously needs tons of these tiny little proteins to work every day, and a lot of them only like I think the half life for most tissues is between like a day and 7 days for each individual protein, and so you need to replenish them over and over again. And the moment that a cell has a gene that's bad for it, it can't like function with that protein without that protein anymore. And all that protein is going to be messed up. And if you have too many that are getting damaged by these reactive oxygen species, then obviously you're going to have to create more of those proteins. And anytime like something goes wrong in this system, it sort of like makes it spin a little further out of whack. It's sort of like your body is millions and billions of these tops spinning around. And when you're born, everything's getting up to speed, they're dividing, it's staying, and each time like a little bump on the surface happens, it doesn't like necessarily stop it ever. And it doesn't like just break off into infinity, but it sort of causes the top to like bump into other tops, and it just saps a little bit of energy every time. And fundamentally, like it just will kill you. There, like I believe the maximum theoretical age is about 122, and at that point, all of your telomeres will be gone. Those are like the ends of the chromosomes, which will decrease every time. That's another like aspect. There's so many little things that are very obviously fine-tuned by evolution to work very well until you're 35. And obviously humans for a long time, 35 was more than enough time, and it is really not in current day. And so it's sort of impossible to avoid all of these little things going wrong over and over again. And I am young enough that I have not had to experience that, but I will, and I imagine many people listening to this probably have. Yeah, that's I guess what biological aging means to me is just like the slow accumulation of errors.
It's kind of interesting to me that at the micro level, disintegration and accumulation both lead to disintegration at the macro level, even though they're
Yeah,
kind of opposites. Something there.
Going back to something you mentioned a bit earlier, but you talked about telomeres a little bit, and if I think of aging, like I normally think of that as sort of one of the main hard kind of final caps, I guess, is that just like eventually, regardless of what you do, even if some random other bad stuff doesn't happen, your cells kind of are just gonna multiply basically a fixed number of times before like right? Because every time they multiply, like some of the DNA gets chopped off, and eventually, once you run out of telomere, it'll just start removing genes, which is pretty bad.
yeah.
But yeah, you were mentioning a lot of other stuff as well. I guess even if telomeres or something were somehow protected, or there's still a lot of other ways that
Oh yeah.
aging would take place, and it's not like just like a one thing to focus on, because I feel like that gets brought up a lot.
Yeah. And also I want to point out that there is a protein called telomerase which manually lengthens telomeres. And they're expressed in like these red blood cell progenitors and like your germline cells. And there's basically cells that have to divide like over the course of like an entire. Basically, every one of the things that causes biological aging has like a mechanism to slow it down. Like reactive oxygen species, antioxidants, very like common way. But the problem is everything you do to increase like the time length of a cell is another step towards causing cancer. As I mentioned, like telomerases are extremely like effective in creating long-term cell lines, but they are also one of the most common like genes that causes cancer to occur, because each individual cell, it's sort of got its own timer. Eventually, something will go wrong enough in this cell that it will either stop functioning entirely or will turn like into a cancerous cell. And necessarily like adding to like the official timer in a lot of people think of is not a very effective way to deal with that, because it just sort of like, oh yes, it will senesce, which is like when a cell becomes just non-functional. It just sits around and does nothing and eventually hopefully gets phagocytosed. But there's two options. It's either that or it becomes cancer. And it will do one of those eventually for every single cell in your body.
So, in your mind, would a total 100% cure for cancer be in the same class of problem as curing aging? Like, if we solved cancer, would aging not be too far behind?
Honestly, yes. Because the moment, like, because a lot of like the forward aging drugs are like the ones that would just cause cancer. And if you can figure out a way to introduce telomerases and such like that in a way that doesn't cause cancer, you very much so can like continue doing that. And I think I mentioned like antioxidants is something that there has been studies done to like prevent anti-aging. And I think there's been in some model organisms, it has like been successful in like statistically significantly increasing age. But I think that like honestly, if you could like fully understand cancer and like stop it into such a degree at a molecular level, you probably could develop some like longevity formulas that are just far more like effective than anything we have today. I don't know if you could ever get to like a true immortality, like
Well, yeah, not immortality, just
um
aging, you know.
but yes, you could 100%. I'm very confident. Maybe not 100% because it's science. You never truly know. But I'm very confident that you could get much past that 122 barrier.
Yeah, I mean, like in my head, I'm just like, okay, cancer is really, really hard to solve because it's essentially
Oh yeah.
equivalent to solving the aging problem. But once we solve it, maybe we'll not age anymore. That would be a cool bonus. It's like, hey, we cured
Yeah.
cancer and also aging. Like, nice.
And part of it is like cancer is like so many different types of cancers with so many different causes. Um, Basically anything that has like the chance to bind to DNA is considered like cancerous. Like, I mean, have you ever seen like Prop 65? Fucking everything on that list is like, I mean, not probably. I don't trust Prop 65 too strongly for. It's the California's like list of things that are known to cause cancer and reproductive harm. If you ever want to get freaked out about some food you're eating or product you're using, look on the back and there's probably a Prop 65 sticker. Because, like, fundamentally, so many things in life will give you cancer because that's how living is.
um, yeah, I think kind of a central theme here is how stuff at different scales manifests quite differently.
Oh,
And
yeah.
there's a lot of sci-fi on this topic. One book that comes to mind is A Swiftly Tilting Planet by Madeleine L'Engle in the Wrinkle in Time series. Another one is one of your favorite books, The Algebraist. But in that case, the scale is more about the focus is more about time than space, right? Although space is certainly a factor. So, you want to tell
Yeah.
us a little bit
So,
about that
The
book?
Algebraist is by Iain M. Banks. I believe I'm not certain if it's his only non-culture sci-fi book, but it's definitely most of his books are culture related. If you are familiar with that series, the only way of doing faster than light travel in that universe is through these like very precise wormholes. And so there's this large like out of the way system that, due to like some like insurgency terrorist attack, loses its wormhole, and like they're cut off from like the main galactic hegemony like 247 years. But then all of a sudden there's this like warning that comes in that like, oh, this other like breakaway sect is going to come and like attack this and try and like take over this system. And so there's a sort of race to see who gets there first. And the book like revolves around this guy named Fasin Tak. And what he does is he researches these things called dwellers. And so dwellers are like the main like dichotomy of scale is dwellers are extremely long living gas giants dwellers, I guess is why they're called that. They have basically inhabit like every gas giant in the entire like known universe pretty much. And they have just done so over the course of literally billions of years. It's rumored that they're like, and for the record, human lifespan in this time frame is still like longer than average because of like these technological innovations, but it's still like on the order of hundreds of years. And whereas like you need to be thousands of years to be even considered like a young adult for these dwellers. And so it's sort of about his experience with like time. Fasten Talk has to like slow down his perception of time to even interact with many of these like dwellers. Like it's frequently mentioned he has to like time by like a 64th to interact with them. And so that's one of like the main dichotomies of scales. Like they're called fast species. These species that act on the order of years, and they have to like they're scrambling for like this thing. And like the galactic hegemony I mentioned is like, oh, it's like this big empire, but the dwellers are like, you've only been around for 20,000 years. We don't care about you. You're little. I think it is directly described as ants scurrying around. And there are like some. It's very interesting in like the dwellers because like there's like the factions of like, oh, there's some that like view them with passion as like interest, but there's so many that are like the plus 50,000-year-old that just like I don't care anymore. And it's sort of about Talk trying to get these dwellers to help him like save his like system from like attack and the sort of arduous trials he goes through as he goes through that process.
With the dwellers, is death considered to be way worse of a tragedy because normal lifespans are just so long?
Interestingly enough, not really. The dwellers, okay, so it's really interesting in their like life cycle because for a start, they're sort of like going back to the biology, they're sort of like an R-type strategist. If so, basically they have a large number of they have a very large number of offspring, and they hunt their own offspring for sport. And for like 50 years or something. And once they reach that point, they've sort of become like, and if those like offspring like die, there's like a passage in the book where he's on this like big dweller ship, and like, oop, one of the main like engines has gone out. So instead of stopping the ship to repair the engine, they're like, okay, we'll send out a bunch of these tiny little sprites to go fix the engine while the ship is still going. And like 12 of them just die. And the dwellers are like, I don't give a shit. And so like they are pretty like fast and loose with their life. But I think yeah, once they get to like the age of like past a few thousand years, yes, I would say it is much like bigger deal. But only for like the dwellers of that age range. They don't really care about like the life of other organisms. They don't really care about like the juveniles.
Would you say that there's like many tiers of it too? Like, do dwellers of old age just like not really give a shit about dwellers who are at middle age?
Yeah, there's very much so a very like there's an extremely rigid hierarchy of like, oh, once you get to 1,000,000 years old, you become like you actually start to have clout. And it's just like the idea that like, oh, to get clout, you need to be 2,000,000 years old is just like that's like fucked up. That's like we humans have not existed for even close to that amount of time. The scales of this thing is like there are individuals that have lived for hundreds of millions of years in this society, and like they're the people who really know what's going on, like care about things. But it's extremely stratified in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in that basically for the Dweller Society, age is pretty much the only hierarchy there is. Well, basically age, and then there's like a currency, which is sort of just like a social status. All of the dwellers are sort of like social climbers, and the only thing they really use for transactions or anything is this sort of, yeah, just social status marker. But in terms of like jobs or something, it's not like they have any political hierarchy or anything. All they have are these clubs which people kind of join as just, something to do. And these include the military, which holds like all these incomprehensibly powerful weapons that are just like, done by dwellers who are just like, oh yeah, it's a hobby. Like I'm sort of good at this. I have some training. And the person who's in charge of sending the nukes or whatever is just like the person in the nuclear submarine rather than some political leader who is ordering these things. It's interesting in that when you're immortal like this, it sort of feels kind of inevitable that age would kind of become the only hierarchy you could have, especially if you're not like dedicating your whole life to a profession or something. It just, yeah, it sort of makes sense, I guess. Because among humans, I feel like you have this thing where, as people age, right, you have this kind of like your experience goes up. So, like, in general, people become more powerful as they age. But at the same time, it's like you have all these aging factors going against you. And, like, there's reasons people have, worries about like most politicians being within their 70s and 80s and whatnot. Even though it's like you have this accumulated experience. But if you don't have any sort of aging factors, it does kind of feel like just accumulating experience over millennia would surpass any other achievements.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like a weird sort of fairness to it, huh? Like perhaps politics would just be way more unequal and crappy if aging wasn't a factor that nerfed the power of old people. It's sort of a ceiling on how bad death can be too. No matter how old you are, there is just something very final about it that's not really going to change. I don't think you're like way less afraid of death at the end necessarily, although there could be other factors that lead to this. I think that it's not really crazy that kids would not have the same moral status as fully grown adults. And I think that that's actually been way more the case in the rest of history. And I don't know enough about history to say this for sure, but I suspect that we're kind of at a high watermark of kids' rights. Kids kind of just have way more power, even political power, than they've ever had before. And if you look at ancient Athenian society, for example, it's kids are almost seen as subhuman almost. It's they kind of need to be done this and need to be done this. Whereas I feel like nowadays, I think kids are sort of seen more as just being kind of like dumb, incompetent adults as opposed to like children as like a separate class of person. But do you think that our society might return to the state of children not necessarily being the same level of moral agent as adults are, or like not really?
I don't really think so. I would think in terms of where, based on how the trends have been going, I think it's likely children will be considered more and more greater moral agents and stuff. But yeah, I definitely agree throughout history that that hasn't really seemed to be the case, especially for like infants or babies. Like I know in a lot of cultures traditional to like not even name your child until they're one because, like half of them are going to die anyway and it kind of, nerfs the sentimental impact if they didn't even have a name. And, from a like within this book with the dwellers, it's like from a certain sense these are like all people that are just like all the kids, even though they're like extremely numerous and, because only, well, I mean, it's never said exactly, but I get the sense that something like maybe like 5% of them actually get out of their childhood stage. But it's only like 1,000th of, what their potential lifespan could be, or probably less. And yeah, I think it's just like they're kind of just like viewed similarly to how we might view like a fetus or something less than an actual,
and I also
like,
will say that
child or
like
moral
in
agent.
Dweller society, there's a lot of just like extremely like life risky behavior that's just sort of like normalized. I think one of like the plot points in the book is around a yacht racing, where it's mentioned that like quite a lot of like young dwellers die at this point. So like it's not like they get out of the like this infantile stage and like we're full adults, we're doing our thing. They still like have to, or they still do a lot of these like exceedingly risky. I mean, they start a war for like the bit. So
Can we run that
starting
section
from where?
back a bit? Just the entire last thing was
Oh,
said. It sounded rough to edit.
yeah. So like Dweller Society has a lot of like commonized behaviors that are like exceedingly dangerous. Like I mentioned the war that they just start for fun. And like they have a bunch of like rules so they don't like actually like have too many casualties, but they're still firing guns at one. And there's like a yacht racing event. They like surf on like plasma waves or some bullshit like that. And it's like I think that's how like one of the main characters died. Is he was just like, I was just surfing on this like plasma wave, and shit like that happens. For the very old dwellers, it is like viewed as like a sad thing, but they also do engage in exceedingly risky behavior with some frequency, which I think is an interesting dynamic.
Do you think that animals with that reproduction strategy are just like less afraid of death because it's not as important for their survival as a species?
I think fundamentally, like a mayfly does not fear death in the same way that like a baby elephant does. Yeah, I think even if they had like a comparable nervous
Mhm.
system, just because it's much more important that the K strategist survives. Well, yeah,
That's kind of
or
interesting.
just saying like if
You
you can
know,
think
I
about it from an
guess. Oh, go
evolutionary
ahead.
standpoint too, it's just like if you have like 1 in 10 like flies that dies before it like sorry 1 in 10 only 1 in 10 flies that makes it to reproduction because they can reproduce so many more times, then that's like fine. It's not ideal, but like that's something that like evolutionarily works. Um, so
You got to max
yeah,
out the horniness
yeah, but
instead
it
of
means that like
the
survival is not going to
self-preservation.
be like selected for in the same way that just going for that food is going to. But for something like elephants, that's no, 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 no. Any like large animal is not going to be able to sustain like 1 in 10 getting to reproduction. So they are going to be much more like survival oriented and therefore fearing of death in their like cognitive processes.
I wonder if the effective altruist people have thought about this. Like, gosh, maybe elephants experience like a 10 times greater fear of death than humans because of like the reproductive
Yeah.
strategy. It's kind of crazy.
I mean, and humans like honestly have like we're pretty high up in terms of like investment
Yeah.
into children go, but like they're definitely we're not the highest.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
It's kind of honestly, it's kind of scary to think about. um,
Well, I feel like to some extent we probably are the highest at this point. No,
well, yeah.
like,
well,
That's
yeah.
because we
and I think you could maybe make an argument that I think it's possible that humans' fear of death, like 200,000 years ago, was probably less than elephants, but might be greater now. That seems plausible
Okay,
to me.
huh? You know what I was gonna say about ancient cultures is, I guess the practice of leaving sickly infants on a hillside, which was done in Sparta, is a lot less barbaric if you consider it from the perspective of not considering infants to be like full people. When we think about that now, we're just like, oh, you left like a whole person on a hill to die, but like to the Spartans, it might not even have been a person. It's like interesting reinterpretation of that situation. I mean, it doesn't change how we view it, but it surely changes how they view it. Since we were talking about genetics, I want to bring up a pretty interesting article that I read recently. It's called Genetics and Eugenics in Frank Herbert's Dune-verse, and it was published by Gwern, who is this prominent Silicon Valley blogger who blogs about a lot of interesting esoteric stuff. You kind of just have to go on gwern.net to get the full experience. But Gwern really likes sci-fi, and in this particular article, Gwern is pretty adamant about the fact that a lot of sci-fi from the past is misinterpreted now because our advanced scientific understanding has made us forget how people thought about science in the past. And so there's things that just kind of seem absurd or magical to us now, but back when these stories were written, they were at the height of popular science. So one story that Gwern mentions in this article is Scanners Live in Vain by Cordwainer Smith, which was published in, I believe, the 50s. And this story is essentially about humans who are sent into space, and a lot of their sensory input is removed to allow them to better handle the conditions of space. And one of the things they talk about a lot is the pain of space, which was basically this idea that if you put someone in space, they would experience a lot of strange, like phantom pain and maybe hallucinations as a result of being in the vacuum of space and not tied down to the Earth, that were speculated as maybe being a possibility as a result of certain aviation experiments. But now that's not a thing. And so when we read that now, we're like, oh, the pain of space. That's like an interesting metaphor for the blackness and emptiness of space. But Gwern's like, no, he actually literally meant pain, the pain of space. And to really appreciate older sci-fi, we have to get a better sense of the scientific context in which they were operating. So the main subject of this article is Frank Herbert. And he was saying that a lot of contemporary critics of science fiction criticized Dune for just having a ridiculous interpretation of genetics. Like, you can't really just breed humans to create the Kwisatz Haderach in the same way that you would breed plants. Like, you can't just do this breeding thing because human reproduction is polygenic. Like, you can't just predict that, you can't just transfer the one gene and just expect all the stuff to be inherited down like that. But Gwern basically says that Frank Herbert was a plant genetic enthusiast as opposed to a human genetics enthusiast. And if you interpret what he wrote in the context of his interest about plant genetics, then it actually makes a lot more sense. And so I think the idea of giving writers more credit in the past or limited knowledge is interesting, but it also has interesting implications for the sci-fi that's written today. Do you guys think that any sci-fi is going to seem hard to understand or interpret in the same way that we struggle to interpret Corvinus Swift now as a result of increasing scientific knowledge?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's just kind of, at least to me, it just kind of feels worse. Like, even if I intellectually might understand that the science fiction writer didn't get anything wrong, right? They're just, operating within the standards of their time, kind of, and using all the information available to them. Like, in my head, I'm still kind of thinking of them as like some high school student or conspiracy theory, or just someone who is like, not doing the proper scientific research or something, because, I have the lens of today and I view it through today's lens, and to me they seem just like, unknowledgeable about scientific things. And I mean, this is something that can obviously happen if you read sci-fi from today as well, where this has literally happened, which is quite common as well, but it kind of feels the same way to me. And I think it's kind of destined to happen in the future as well. Yeah, a lot of sci-fi today will kind of not age that well because, whatever scientific theories are behind it may be disproved. I don't know if you all feel the same way in terms of it just making it feel more juvenile, sort of, I guess. But definitely does have that
I guess
effect on
if
me.
you believe in, going back to the previous episode, since you believe in hard separation of the art and the artist, does that not really change your appreciation of it to know that they were working with the best scientific knowledge that they had at the time? It's that just like doesn't, it shouldn't matter, or is that kind of separate?
Yeah, yeah. I guess that could be maybe the root of why we may view this differently. But yeah, it is kind of separate to me. I mean, it's like a nice thing to hear, and I obviously have opinions on the author as well, and it'll like, make me definitely like make me think about that author more. It's like, maybe instead of viewing them as like, oh, they had this bad story, I'm like, oh, they had this bad story, but like they just got unlucky, to be honest. This, it wasn't a fault of them, it was out of their control. But I would still not view that
So
story
I guess
favorably.
then, how would you handle science fiction of today that ends up aging poorly? Like, would you say that the art is sort of retroactively made worse, or that art can really only be evaluated within a certain temporal context or context of scientific knowledge?
Yeah, I'm not super, I guess, objectivity pilled in terms of art. I think art is generally a very subjective experience. Like, I think there's some amount of, objectively better and objectively worse art, but, most of the value of an art depends on the context in which it is viewed. And, the art that I appreciate is obviously going to be different than someone 500 years in the future. And so I think it is just, yeah, good art now, but maybe not good art
So in
in the
that sense,
future.
do you have a strong bias towards modern art?
I mean, I don't think for a lot of things it matters too much, but I do think in terms of sci-fi in particular, it has this sense where, because the scientific consensus can just like move past previously, held ideas, it can definitely happen. But there's still obviously a lot of questions that are brought up that may never be answered that become the basis for sci-fi.
Oh.
So there's a lot of stuff that doesn't
So in
really
this,
age out, I feel
I
like.
guess in the span of your life, like, do you think a sci-fi novel could go from being like really good to like really bad as a result of scientific knowledge? Like you're like, oh, when I was 10, this book was really good, but now that I'm like 70 and scientific knowledge is XYZ, it sucks now. Like, is that a take you would imagine yourself having? Not only that you like it more, but that also it's just like worse art.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of an example, but I think there are a lot of sci-fi books set in the reasonably far future in which like AI is legitimately worse than it is, today right now. Um and that does like nerf it for sure for me. And I guess maybe gets like progressively nerfed a bit more every year as AI progresses.
Okay. I mean, sure.
Um,
I mean, where do you stand on this, Ewan?
I love dated media. When I have read like um or I guess I love media that is like explicitly dated. In like and obviously not in like some societal standard ways. Like watching late 90s anime makes me die every time due to the sexism, but like I I don't think reading something and being like, "Oh, that's not how physics or biology or chemistry works," makes me detract from the experience. I think the most obvious example of this is how different places portray the internet. I think this is something that like is the most prescient because it's something that's like very all consuming in a lot of people's lives. And it was sort of obvious that computers were always going to be this thing, but like how it's portrayed is very like stratified by like even by decade. But I don't think it like detracts from my appreciation. Like I feel like reading The Invisible Man, I don't be like, science is bad. I just like how this is portrayed. I feel like I'm just like, oh, this is a book from the early 20th century.
So you can kind of get around the question because seeing worse, or I guess really what I'm trying to get at is if you learned that a whack thing in a work of science fiction was the result of incomplete scientific understanding at the time it was written, as opposed to the author just kind of like being a dumbass, would that change your appreciation of the work itself?
I I think it might like add some nuance, but I don't think so.
Okay.
I think in my mind, the scientific concepts are integral to a lot of like works, but as long as they make some like coherent sense and like tie into the larger, more interesting part of sci-fi, which is like the characters and the implications that the technologies have, as long as that's still interesting. And I think that's the kind of thing that like it's not going to like, oh, 10 years ago this like book had some like scientific inaccuracies, but I don't think it like detracts from the rest of the science in a way that's super impactful to me. I understand if some people would feel that way, but I just like think it doesn't lessen the art if they didn't know how genetics work.
The a reason a The reason a science fiction story could have inaccurate science could either be because scientific knowledge wasn't there yet, or because the scientific
Or
knowledge
they're
was
bad.
there and they were just bad. So
Okay.
I'm saying, like, if you know the first thing to be the case, does that change how you view the art, really, or like not really?
Oh, so like the first thing versus the second thing.
Yeah.
I guess at that point it might. In my mind, most of like the good sci-fi authors do care about like the science and like the building blocks of the world they're creating. And if I learned that like, oh, they just weren't really very careful with creating these things, it might impact my enjoyment. But honestly, I still don't really think so. I think if you told that to me about a book going in, I
Mhm.
think it might impact my ability. But I think by the time I finish and I have cemented my ideas about the book, I do not think just learning that this person's like, oh, they just didn't really have a good grasp of theoretical physics. As long as it's not like super obvious to me reading the book, I don't think getting told afterwards it would be like making me feel bad. that sort of makes sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Something I will say for my position is, I guess, if it's very clear that it's dated, rather than like it could be in either of those two camps, I think I'm more fine with it. Like if there was a book in which the outside world is the luminiferous aether or whatever, and all of the characters are like, oh yeah, obviously, you know, you go outside and it's the luminiferous aether, I'd be more fine with that than something where time dilation doesn't occur, right? And it's like maybe the time dilation thing not occurring was also dated because like they didn't know that was a thing yet. But that also is something that people now might not realize that are just bad. Where no one who is like just bad now is out here believing in
You never
the
know in
luminiferous
2024,
right? So yeah, I guess not. There are definitely some people.
Dude, that's the new political movement, luminiferous ether believers. You know, it's the cool flat earthers.
Yeah.
Morley was a hack.
One thing that's interesting to me is when authors will put out a work that is designed to seem like it's made in a certain era, but it's actually not. I remember seeing this YouTube channel where this person was trying to put out YouTube vlogs that specifically looked like they were made in the aughts and referencing things that happened in the aughts as if they had just happened, but they were just posting them in like 2023. Like they're not in the aughts, but you honestly like maybe couldn't tell, like except for, you know, seeing the date of the video and stuff. And so in that context, I think that they're very much trying to be self-aware about they're trying to make the art self-aware about the fact that it is dated. I'm wondering if you could do that in reverse. Like, do you think there's a way you could write sci-fi that's self-aware about how it's dated for future people, or is that not really possible?
No, I think you could do that.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could just infuse your writing with like enough like flippantness, like kind of like wasn't it funny? That's what people like thought back then. Well, just like directly saying absolutely what you believe, and like give it that sort of feeling. But it feels kind of hard to do. I mean, I think to some extent you might just have to go through with it. I don't know. And just do it normally, and you know, maybe it'll survive the test of time.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think this concept of writing for the future is interesting because most fiction that's produced today is specifically designed to sell to a modern audience, which makes sense because that's how you get people to read your stuff. But especially in literary fiction, I think you have more authors that are trying to write for the future. They're trying to write in such a way that doesn't automatically date them, and they're trying to write in a way that's more timeless and appealing to people in the future. And the way that they model this is they just kind of write stuff based not just on what's popular now, but what's popular in the past, with the idea that if something was popular a long time ago and it's popular now, it's probably going to be popular in the future. But I'm wondering, like, to what extent writing for the future is possible? Like, how much of a thing is this that you can do?
I guess in terms of like writing that book, how you would write it, you sort of like, I guess what you could do is you could look at books that are perceived as ahead of their time in the past, try and figure out what makes them different from other books at the time, and then try and get that essence. But also, I think that kind of just creates like, yeah,
I think that's kind of what
you're kind of
literary
just like
authors
creating,
do.
you're trying to create something like distinctly unique, I think is the trick. But I think part of the issue is like, to some degree, the books that are ahead of their time are sort of like self-fulfilling prophecies, and that they sort of like create the stuff like later in terms of like maybe a book is like ahead of its time and it's not necessarily like commercially successful, but like the people who are the next generation of writers see this like, oh, this is really cool, this is the shit I'm gonna write. And so they sort of like, or
Yeah, that
yeah, they sort of just like self-fulfill them into being books of the future by just inspiring future writers at a higher rate than like other books of their time.
Yeah, that's true. Or they can even just invent technology. Like, I'm pretty sure Arthur C. Clarke is partially credited for inventing the communication satellite, which is kind of crazy. He just like wrote about it. um, but I think that that's actually something that is missing a lot in science fiction, and also like I guess low fantasy, because these are more explicitly genres for entertainment. than literary fiction. I think that a lot of sci-fi just kind of seems like it will be dated in the future. Like you just read it and you're like, this is going to be dated really quickly. And one thing that I like about Ted Chiang specifically is that I think his stories feel distinctly not dated, or they're sort of absent of the things that would immediately feel like they would date a work, if that makes sense. That's kind of the vibe I get when I'm reading them. And I rarely feel that when I'm reading contemporary short story authors. So it's sort of cool that that exists now. I would also say that I feel this way about Ursula.
Oh yeah. So yeah, this really it reminds me of short story by Ted Chiang called Understand. And so Understand is it's about this guy who like has like severe nerve damage. He's like comatose vegetable level nerve damage. And they give him this drug um I believe it's called like hormone K. And basically it's like, it's gonna like regen your neurons. But it regens so many neurons, he becomes like genuinely superhuman in his like cognitive abilities. And it's about his like trials and tribulations through that. But it's really interesting because it feels like I believe it was published in like early 90s. I think it like won an award in like 1991. And but like
Yeah, sounds right.
it doesn't it feels like like when I was reading it, I was like imagining modern. I was like, Boston was like, yeah, like Boston, like current Boston, not like dated in any way. And like it talks about like the data net, which was like a word that's like, yeah, that's not really used that much now. But it didn't feel like it was. It felt like it could have been oh, this is going to be used in 20 years, or this was used 20 years ago. And like my brain didn't really like tie down which one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that also while reading Understand, I also read it pretty recently. It didn't feel dated at all. I also feel like it just wasn't really that good. I think the protagonist became super intelligent and stuff, and it was told from this first person point of view, and the main way in which he was intelligent was just being really good at recognizing patterns between a bunch of different things, and the word gestalt was used quite a number of times to describe him just like implicitly sort of gaining knowledge of everything kind of. But the character just wasn't really that compelling to me. And yeah, as a result, even though I think like the framework on which the story was set was like very solid, because I didn't really care about any of the characters, I feel like it just didn't really hit as a story. I don't know if you all would agree with that, but
I think for me, I don't know if this is true or not, but the story very much felt like some sort of homage to Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, which also follows a character becoming super intelligent. I mean, it's also related on the Wikipedia page, so there's at least something there. But this is something that a lot of sci-fi authors do, writing short stories that are in conversation with previous short stories. Another example I can think of is Ted Chiang writing The Merchant and the Alchemist's Gate, which I believe is a sort of retelling of some of the Heinlein short stories, but with a Muslim vibe. It's like set in the Muslim world, and that adds a certain interestingness to it. And I guess I just don't really like this form of short story that much. This is not really like a knock on Ted Chiang in particular, because I really like his stuff. But I think that whenever I read sci-fi, I'm mainly in it for the world and the new ideas. And I just don't get as much out of a reinterpretation, even compared to reinterpretations in other genres, which I'm also kind of like on. And so I think that was the main reason why I was kind of low on it, is because a lot of the themes just felt similar to other sci-fi short stories. And while I can't say that it wasn't well written or well constructed, I was just not really as wowed by what I should be getting, especially compared to the previous story in the collection, Tower of Babylon, which is just like, whoa, there's so many ideas. So that's basically how I felt about it.
I didn't really mind like I guess the way I perceived it is that like Flowers for Algernon takes the correct exit ramp for the story. The guy like gets like very smart. He gets like smart to a comprehensible level, and he's like, "Oh, this is how you should have done the smartness." And then it's like, "Ah, I guess I'll go back down again." But I guess like what Ted Chiang is sort of imagining, what if he was just like, "Fuck the doctor. I'm gonna keep getting smarter." And obviously, it wasn't like as like petulant as that, but it's sort of like it was enough different of like an extension that I found it still compelling, even though I've like read also Flash Ratchet on relatively recently. I just felt like the stuff that was added just sort of was sort of incomprehensible. Yeah, I was like, I didn't find the characters too like um negative in the same way that Gordon did. Um, Obviously, no one was really well fleshed out. Um, I guess part of the big problem is there was such big changes across the 20 pages that like you didn't really feel like you understood the character because immediately you're like, ah, I get this guy. He's vibing, and then he takes another dose hormone K, and he's like, activate Gestalt mode, and I'm like, okay, I guess I get to read some incredibly new prose.
Yeah,
Um, I definitely felt like it was the least compelling because the ending was just sort of borderline incomprehensible. And that's inherently when you're telling a first point of view narrative with somebody who is designed to be incomprehensibly smart, it's going to be incomprehensible. But at the same time, if your story is incomprehensible, then it's just like, why
I,
did you write it?
I agree with you
Um,
that adding a lot of interiority to a super intelligent character is a huge creative risk. Most of the depictions of super intelligent entities that I've seen that I would consider successful are very much show don't tell. You don't really get that close to the being in question. Like in Ex Machina, for example, which I think is a great example of portraying superintelligence. The superintelligence has very limited resources, and so you don't really need to explore its full capabilities. And obviously, the movie isn't shown from its point of view, so there's not really too much that the director actually has to show explicitly about the nuts and bolts of its thought process. I think that once you get into the territory of having to explore the interiority of a super intelligent character, then you are really at risk of either being kind of incomprehensible or not really being realistic, or as we were saying before, kind of dated upon arrival of the next super intelligent entity. But I do appreciate the attempt, if nothing else. I think it is something that should be tried.
yeah, and I guess like part of the reason, like in Flowers for Algernon did have like I'm forgetting the main character's name, but he very much so was like a super intelligent character. And if it was told from his like direct first person point of view, I think it probably would have been difficult to track if it was like written in a way that was like accurate. But because it was like a secondary abstraction of his journal entries, it definitely helped like remove you from like the stream that's too strong.
Yeah,
I think trying to think of like other examples of like super intelligent characters in the media. I think the minds from Iain M. Banks's The Culture series are like these crazy supercomputers, and he very explicitly is like these things they go burr. You can't comprehend, but they know a lot of things. And he sort of leaves it at that, which I think is like kind of like non-risky, kind of hand wavy, but like it definitely makes more sense, which is like fundamentally kind of
yeah,
convenient.
well, there's a lot of different ways you can depict super capabilities in general. Like I think that there are some ways that can be done better than others. I think that one of the reasons that it was hard to do it creatively in this story is because you see, not only do you have a super intelligent entity where you're peering directly into their head, but you also have them in situations that would be particularly hard to understand a super intelligent entity doing, in particular, like engaging in direct conflict with another super intelligent entity. That's something that's basically impossible to imagine for anyone living now who is a human. And I think that it's easier to depict superintelligence if the superintelligence isn't as relevant to what's actually happening. I think that makes it easier to humanize the character and make their interactions comprehensible. You have a lot of settings where, even going back into ancient history, like gods that are just explicitly projecting as human forms and able to better carry through a narrative. Like part of the reason those myths work is because gods reduce themselves to the level of mortals so that they can actually have a real narrative as opposed to something incomprehensible. A pretty interesting approach that I saw in a short film is World of Tomorrow by Don Hertzfeldt, which is definitely one of my favorite films. I don't know how high up there it is because it's a 15-minute short film rather than a feature-length film, so it's kind of hard to square it, but I really like this film a lot because it covers a lot of themes that I really like, mainly big time scales, time travel, cultural change, but then also children, which is sort of the most interesting part of it. The film was basically constructed from raw audio from the director's, I believe it was their niece, like their toddler, where they just recorded kind of random gibberish that their niece said for like over a really long period of time, and then decided to construct a film around this dialogue and just get the best bits of that and put it in the film. So the concept they chose to run with is that the niece is actually a character in the story, and she's being visited by a third generation clone of herself from many, many centuries into the future in order for that clone to retrieve a long lost childhood memory. And the clone isn't really exhibiting their obviously strong capabilities as a result of being in the future, and they're not really trying to interact with the kid on their level. It's pretty clear that the main purpose of their visit is kind of for themselves. You know, they're just kind of trying to have a reflection moment, explore their own interiority, and the kid, even though it is them, is more of like a vector for this as opposed to like a real one-on-one counterpart. And I think that does make the whole concept work because a lot of the dialogue is just kind of incomprehensible. You know, they're not saying like full on sentences. They're just like blue, yellow, blue, orange. But I think that the contrast between just actual raw, unfiltered kid dialogue that's pretty funny and just this extremely stoic, jaded clone from far in the future is just very funny, but also very interesting, especially because of the same person. And there's just a lot of pretty unique interaction that come out of it that you wouldn't see in any other sci-fi film. But both Gordon and Ewan watch World of Tomorrow. Do you guys have any thoughts about it? Is it one of your favorite films as well, or not quite as high on it?
I would say it's one of my favorite like short films. I've only watched it recently, but I did really, really enjoy it. Um, I guess the main thing that like struck me about the film was the distinct lack of humanity in this like far future world that's being described by like the third generation Emily. Especially in like the stark contrast of like the exceedingly real humanity that's like this 5-year-old and this like eyes wide open just like pointing at things. It's just like and there's like but then there's also like the lower classes getting sent to like the deep data net. Like
Yeah, there's this particularly dystopian part of the film where there's all of these shooting stars in the sky, and Emily's explaining that these shooting stars are actually just bodies, because there's a coming apocalypse, and in order to escape it, the lower classes opt for kind of like low budget time travel that will often have the side effect of just dropping you into the vacuum of space, just sort of close to Earth because you got the spatial coordinates slightly wrong, accounting for the movement of the Earth. And so you just have like masses and masses of just poor people trying to try and travel out of the apocalypse that are just like coming down to Earth as shooting stars. It's like pretty fucked up, but you know, there's definitely some dark humor there.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's quite one of my favorite movies, but I definitely think it's some of the hardest I've laughed at a movie. And yeah, there is something sort of surreal about just like these just like completely monotone, inhumane descriptions of like a dystopian reality, just like juxtaposed with the reactions of a literal 5-year-old.
What do you guys think that what do you guys think some of the main themes of World Tomorrow are?
Probably loss. I guess, yeah, because it's mentioned that like the Emily clone, like part of the reason she's coming back is because her husband died. I think there's like a utterly fucking like tragic thing she says is like, oh, I don't think I have the emotional capability to like deal with this, so sometimes I just sit there and I cry for no reason. And that's like, and this is like mentioned like pretty late into the film as like a backdrop. This like monotone, like borderline robotic character just drops that her
She's like
husband
sitting in
died.
she's just like
And she's,
sitting in this dark chair, and it's just like,
yeah.
and then I feel really sad.
Or I would say something along the lines of just the importance of, I don't know, just having emotions and humanity and innocence. And like, while I feel like while watching the movie, even though it's pretty short, I think the kid just like gets less and less annoying and more comforting throughout, kind of, even though she's just like doing the same shit. But it's just like the juxtaposition between the dystopian future world that's being described, it's just more and more, it's just like comforting to hear some babbling and whatnot. Yeah, I think thematically it's kind of just going for something, in that we as humans don't want a future where we lose our humanity.
Mhm. Yeah, Don Hertzfeldt has made a few animated films. There's also some sequels to World of Tomorrow, but then he's made a few films that are a bit more just straight depressing. He made this film called It's a Beautiful Day, which is just kind of about mortality and explores these themes in greater depth. And that is just kind of the vibe of his work. He wants people to reflect on, well, what really makes a human life human, and how should we act in accordance with that? And I think that this medium of animation and having an actual kid there just really works. And I think that it's just able to provide a really, really unique perspective that not only do I not see it being done anywhere else, but I don't even know if it could be. Like, I can't really see a major movie studio greenlighting something like World of Tomorrow because it's just too edgy in too many ways. And I think it's really just kind of like one guy. Like, I think he's just an animator and a writer, and I really like his work. I would be interested to see another of his films. Speaking of collapse, I wanted to talk about two fantasy series, which we haven't talked much about fantasy on the pod yet, but um, there are two book series that are quite popular in fantasy that are interesting parallels to me. One of them is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, and one of them is The Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. Warning, major spoilers for Mistborn are ahead. But the reason that I think that they're similar to each other, or at least foils for each other, is that in Mistborn, the big twist of the entire series is that it's set in a fallen world where a hero that gets referenced a lot in the story actually failed in what they were attempting to do. And the characters of the story are just kind of inhabiting the ashes of this previously better world. But it takes a long time into the series before you actually learn of this. There's just kind of vague hints that things are a lot worse than they used to be, that just cast a vibe over the whole thing. Um, Whereas the Kingkiller Chronicle is kind of the opposite, and I guess more conventional, where there is this frame story that brackets the main story that just vaguely hints a lot of times that, maybe not even vaguely, just directly hints a lot that the world, in the world, the frame story that's 5 years after the main one, is just way worse, and something bad happened related to the characters in this central story, and that definitely casts a certain vibe over the story as well. So I just wanted to ask Ewan, you're a pretty big fan of both. How do you think that the reading experience was different between those two books, and how is it the same as a result of this, ominous doom layer over the whole thing?
Yeah, so I think it's tricky because looking at just like the main stories for each, well, I guess neither of them are particularly happy. But like it's much more obvious that things in like Kingkiller Chronicle are on like an upwards trajectory. It's sort of, or at least like for Kvothe, the main character, it's about like following him. Basically, his whole family and like life gets upended because they summoned this like the Chandrain, some like scary beast by invoking their name too many times. But like consistently over the course of the story, it's him like getting his shit together, like getting on the up and up. Whereas for Mistborn, it's much darker already in that it's about her like, overthrowing tyrannical like supreme leader. I forget his precise title. And then dealing with like the aftermath of people dying. But I think it's much more hopeful for Mistborn. It's sort of like shit is already bad, shit is terrible. Let's go like make it better. Let's see if we can overthrow the tyrannical government. Let's see if we can get these like feuding wars down. Maybe acquire the power from like the font, like the fountain of whatever the fuck it's called, and like make society like a better place. And they're always like struggling against ruin, I believe, is the main antagonist of that trilogy. But it's much more good versus evil core, if that sort of makes sense. It's very obvious that like we're gonna like do some pro societal change, whereas for like Kvothe, it's fundamentally a story of revenge. It's a story of him trying to find the mythical creatures, like the borderline gods that like killed his family, and he does a lot of like suspect things to try and like. I believe there is one point where like he like almost tracks them down in like a forest, and he basically just calls down lightning to strike a tree, and he kills like dozens of people. Like there's like a scene where there's some people like impersonating like a set of travelers, and he just like slits their throats. And it's like really concerningly dark in a way that like Mistborn is not, and it's definitely not like every part of that story, but it's very obvious that like especially from the frame story that like Kvothe has done some shit. He's done some like real serious shit trying to like avenge himself, and it's going to end poorly. Whereas in Mistborn, it's the bad shit has already happened, and it's sort of about trying to rectify it and create a new society.
Yeah. I haven't read Mistborn, but in the Kingkiller Chronicle, I think something interesting in that is literally the name of the story, in which this is a trilogy in which the third book hasn't come out yet, and may never come out. It's been quite a bit, but the main character is known as this Kingkiller, and this hasn't happened yet, but must happen at some point before the frame story occurs, and he's sort of a broken man telling the story. In the original story, he's kind of this like can do no wrong sort of hero. He's like both just the most talented person at magic and the most talented person at music, in the world probably, and can sort of just do whatever. But at the same time, he has just like these ridiculously lofty goals, and they are clearly not accomplished by the end in the way he would want them to be, and it creates a sort of interesting tone for the book, because it's sort of like every problem that comes to him sort of gets overcome, but like at some point there's gonna be something that where he sort of falters, and it adds a degree of stress to everything, I would say.
I guess you're the Mistborn reader, Kevin. Do you have thoughts about like how does Mistborn feel like a hopeful trilogy to you?
I think Mistborn feels pretty hopeful. I do like the subtlety. I mean, you mentioned that it's pretty obvious that something bad will happen in the Kingkiller Chronicle, whereas in Mistborn, the fact that the world has fallen is supposed to be sort of a surprise, and that's kind of the point. So it's not as explicit when you're reading it, but there definitely is like environmental foreshadowing. It's like, why is there ash everywhere? That's crazy. Like, there's certain things where, in retrospect, you're just like, oh, I see. Okay. So I think it's more the effect of just kind of clarifying the feelings that you already felt as opposed to like getting you to feel a certain way in your head. I think that's a pretty good note to wrap things up on. I want to thank Euan for coming on the pod. And as a final note, Euan, is there any piece of short media that you would like to recommend to the audience?
Yeah, so I guess the short story that came to mind first is a short story I wrote called The Backgammon Player. It's about the idea of utter perfection and how unattainable it could ever possibly be. I think is the way I would describe it. But yeah, it's pretty short. I think it's really interesting. So I'd appreciate if you gave it a read. I believe it will be linked somewhere in the article.
Yeah, it'll be the first original story published exclusively, maybe not exclusively, on Synthesized Sunsets. So you guys can check that out. Well, thanks again, Euan, for coming on the pod, and we will see you all next week.